Today's episode of Cowboy Crossroads is sponsored by my friends at Republic Boot Company in Houston, Texas. Republic Boot Company specializes in handmade, custom cowboy boots. They've made boots for Cowboy Crossroads guests like Tom Russell and Ramblin' Jack Elliott, and they've made boots for yours truly. They can build just about any boot that you can imagine. You can check them out online at republicbootcompany.com. This episode is also brought to you by the members of my Patreon page, and I'd like to thank my Trail Boss member, Bob Kelly, for his support. Patreon is a platform that allows you to offer monthly support to creative projects that you enjoy, and in return, you get access to some exclusive content. If you're enjoying this show, you can become a patron of Cowboy Crossroads at patreon.com/Cowboy Crossroads. That's patreon.com/Cowboy Crossroads. I'd like to start today's show with a poem written by Bruce Kiskaden. Bruce Kiskaden is one of the classic old-time poets, and he is sometimes called the Cowboys' cowboy poet. This piece of his is entitled, "The Man on the Fence." There's a man that I would speak about. You see him everywhere. He puts out conversations till he mangles up the air. No matter what the subject is, his ideas are immense, but he don't go into action. He's the man that's on the fence. When the owners ship out cattle, they have all that they can do. The buyers and the waddies, they are mighty busy too. Who explains the situation to a bunch of idle gents? I needn't tell nobody, it's the feller on the fence. Who is it that can tell you how a bronco should be rode? Who is it laughs the loudest at a feller when he's throwed? Who tries to be sarcastic when he makes his wise comments? Whose pants is full of splinters? It's the man that's on the fence. Who is it puts a swagger on but never gets in trouble? If he ever gets in danger, who can vanish like a bubble? Who can tell about a battle till he holds the crowd plumb tense, though perhaps he never seen it? It's the feller on the fence. Who hollers at old-timers as if they were his pals? Who has set and spurred the splinters from 100-odd corrals? Who has spurred the gates and fence rails till the boys all know the dents? It's the man that's always present. It's the feller on the fence. No, he ain't no use for nothing, and he sure does eat a lot, and he does a heap of talking that would get a real man shot. But the outfit tolerates him, though he ain't worth 30 cents, for he's really right amusin', that there feller on the fence. And it helps an honest waddy when he's done his best and failed, just to stop and look and listen at the feller on the rail. For he knows down in his gizzard, if he's got an ounce of sense, that he's done a darn sight better than the man that's on the fence. Howdy folks, this is Andy Hedges, and you're listening to Cowboy Crossroads. On each episode, I interview a different guest and ask them to share stories and discuss music, poetry, and culture from the working cowboy West and beyond. My guest today is Michael Stevens. Michael Stevens is a singer, songwriter, and guitar builder. He's considered one of the world's finest builders of electric stringed instruments, and he was one of the co-founders of the Fender Custom Shop in 1986. His guitar customers have included Eric Clapton, Buddy Guy, and Junior Brown. Michael has also been involved in the horse business throughout his life, and he's made his home in Alpine, Texas since 1991. He sings and writes cowboy songs and has been a regular performer at the Texas Cowboy Poetry Gathering in Alpine and was recently featured at the National Cowboy Poetry Gathering in Elko, Nevada. I went to visit Michael at his home outside of Alpine, and he gave me a tour of his incredible shop and we sat around looking at Michael's bit collection and thumbing through old cowboy songbooks. We finally sat down at the kitchen table and recorded this interview. We started out by discussing Michael's childhood in Ohio and their rich horse culture. Here's Michael Stevens.
That was Ohio. And whether you know it, you probably don't, that post-World War Ohio had more horses per capita than any state in the Union. Any state. And it's because we had Amish. The Standardbred Association is in southern Ohio, which is the sulky racing or harness racing. And then every farmer had a team. And then right after World War II, quarter horses got to be very, it was the pleasure horse to have. And the wave hit the country. And the largest single breed show in the world, I think, is still the Quarter Horse Congress in Columbus, Ohio. My brother has been a ringmaster, which they call stewards now, for about 45 years. It's a month long. They go to Columbus for a month. They book in a room in for a month. That's how long the show is. I went up one time and did some halter classes for him, and, Western Pleasure had 300 entries, and this was back in that would have been in the 70s. Talk about boring. But it's a giant show. And so when I started baling hay as a kid at 12, you're big enough, Dad sends you out to help farmers load hay and stuff like that. A lot of them had one tractor, and they had a team of horses. Because they'd had a team of horses before the war, and nobody could have a tractor during the war, so you'd be out gathering hay on a wagon and a team. I was driving those, or at least keeping the reins from falling on the ground as a kid, 6 or 7, 8 years old, standing up there holding those lines, and probably the farmer was hollering at the horses. And then, of course, Amish everywhere. We have as many Amish easily as Pennsylvania, so that was saturated. There was horses everywhere. And that's how my dad grew up, prior to that, in the 30s, cars were a little sparse still. So, and he wanted to be a cowboy. And his parents, for his 19th birthday, when he came to the dinner table, his plate was upside down, and he turned it over, and there was a bus ticket to Midland, Texas, and $20. And he left. He'd been did horses in the park, and everybody had horses and buggy, all that stuff. So he knew that. He knew about animals, but he wanted to be a cowboy, and they let him go. And he must have read something about Midland. I don't know how he figured that one out. But so after the war, he came home and was working for the power company. He'd gone to, right before the war broke out, he went to work for Western Union as a lineman. And when the war broke out, his brother signed up and went in the Army, and he wanted to go to the Army, but the government said, "Son, you are in the Army. We have taken over Western Union. We need them. We need you. Go home." And so he worked in the Dakotas all World War II, because there was all those air bases up there and training bases and bomber bases and stuff, and they were running telegraph lines. When he got back to Ohio, and he must have come home, I figure he came home for Thanksgiving in 44, because I was born in August of 45, 7 days after VJ Day, August 22nd, 1945. So he must have come home, a little ahead of that. So he was always working. He went with the electrical company, but ever since all I remember is him as a cowboy. When we were little kids, he'd come and tuck us in, and he'd be wearing his roping spurs so we could hear him. Back then, he probably took them off to drive, but he'd come up to your bedroom and say goodnight to us, and off he'd go jackpot roping for years. And then when we got old enough to go, we piled in that car and went with him. This was pre-gooseneck truck days. He liked Olds 88s and a 2-horse Miley trailer. And he'd have a roping horse on one side and 3 or 4 calves on the other side. So when all those guys got somewhere they were going to go rope all night till 1 or 2 in the morning, You got 10 guys, and each of them got 3 or 4 calves. Well, hell, you got a little herd. And then later, when my brother and I came along, he started getting those big flatbed trucks and putting wood racks on them, and ramps and stalls and places to put saddles. And so we hauled everything in what I called Yankee trucks, from 3 to, sometimes, you get 3 to 10 horses in some of those big, long 16-footers. But he never bought any one of the big, long ones, but we always seemed we'd go somewhere, we'd have 3 horses, always have 3 horses. And when he quit going to the little horse shows, we always took 3 horses. My brother and I just had an extra horse. And we do all his contest classes, because back then nobody thought women had to ride barrels. Everybody did. And all kinds of games, egg and spoon, trying not to drop it in your lap, and reining classes, and barrel crawl through, and the pickup race. My brother, he'd ride all 3 horses and come down around the barrel, and I'd be down there at the end. And I'd Pony Express, or just when he tipped that horse around that barrel, I'd just step on, and you race back to the other end. And if we'd win a few classes and get another handful of quarters, you go enter some more classes. Just anything. The old man start you out with a couple bucks, quarters. And you just, if you kept winning classes, and they paying kids quarters because they knew they'd go put it back in. And we did that in county fairs and little horse shows and little riding club things. And so that's how I grew up. That's all I knew on the weekends, man. We were off. And trail rides were big back then. You'd go to somebody's farm, and they had laid it out where you could go through fences and go to gates and cowboy gates and come back around. There'd be like 80 riders. And some parked in some valley below their barn or something, and women out there cooking, and a horse troughs full of soft drinks, and kids playing, and you'd ride for half a day and come back in, and then they'd go another direction and come back in, and everybody pack up and go home. It was just like a big social deal. And then eventually it evolved into endurance riding. And we quit. I didn't get as much roping as I wanted, but he kind of morphed into, I was kind of stuck. You're a kid, even though you're big as he is. And we started doing endurance rides and he was state champion 1 or 2 years with this big Morgan horse, beating the hell out of the Arabs. But every night, when those things started happening, every night that he got home from work, we ate supper at 4:30 or whatever he wanted to eat the minute he got to the house. And we'd go saddle horses and ride 20 miles every day. And the other people who had Arabs, who should have been good endurance horses, well, they would just get them out on the weekend, right? Well, his horses were like football players in shape. And we just take off at a trot down those gravel roads and around the farm there in Ohio, and just hit a high lick and just go. And so that's kind of my whole background there, was what I remember, from the day that saddle showed up. I probably do the poem of that saddle when it arrived. It'd been somewhere mid-1950, I bet. I was 5. And that would have been where you saw the picture of us on the tricycle and the tractor. That was at that house is where that saddle showed up, and I would have been about 5 years old there. So I grew up wanting to come to Texas. Just couldn't even, that's all I ever thought about, was getting out of there, because if you wore your clothes like this to high school, everybody looked at you like you were nuts, even though you dated cheerleaders and played football and did all that stuff. If you weren't in your Ivy League stuff and wore high-heel boots, and of course everybody had a fringe jacket. The whole family, everybody had their own fringe jacket in the 50s. And it was real popular. But the kids at school would look at me like I was nuts. And they knew me. It's like, well, okay. I was wearing high-heel boots with chocolate brown pointy toes and red tops. He had them made at Champion in El Paso. And we wore a lot of Justins, because you could send boots back to Justin in those days and get them revamped for $17. Of course, brand new boots were probably only $34 then anyway. So, but I just didn't wear them to school. And then if your friends would come see you at a horse show or a little county fair or something like that, and you're all duded up like that, they loved it. but they didn't like it when you went to school. And a lot of the county fairs were just like those John Wayne movies, the early ones you see. They'd block off the racetrack right by the front grandstand, across the ends of it, and that's where the horse show would be, in the racetrack. Because all during the day, you'd start out in the morning with horse pulls and pony pulls, and of course, it morphed into tractor pulls too. And then they'd drag that arena, and then have harness racing half the day, and then they'd close it off at night because they had lights and grandstand, and have these little horse shows right there in front of the grandstand for the county fairs. And we just hit the county fair circuit every weekend. When they started happening in the spring, we were gone all the time. But we weren't gathering cattle, unfortunately. But all I had to do was bang a bucket, and the milk cows came to the barn. So much for roundups. But
what about the guitars? Was that an interest as a kid as well?
Yeah, a little bit. I remember having a guitar. And I remember it was called an Old Craftsman. Since then, I found out what that means, which was not much. But it was, I think, Old Craftsman was a little line of K or somebody maybe made for, not Sears, but I never learned how to play it or tune it. And I don't know where the guitar went or why. I just knew I got it and wanted it. And I would whistle a lot and sing when I was riding my horse, with no instrument, and just was always whistling, which you can't do worth a damn anymore. And then when I first went to college, I took a few vocal lessons as an Ivy Leaguer. Kind of was trying to shed my image of a bumpkin, realized that I liked my bumpkin image. Because I was really into Robert Goulet. I could sing all those Camelot, Samoa, Samoa, a knight at the table round must be invincible. That helped, and I love Goulet's curly, permed hair, but and that's when, and I run into a roommate there in college. He and I were running a parking lot, a fancy restaurant where on the good nights, we'd turn 600 cars easy in and out of that restaurant. And at some point in the rush hour, we'd have like 8 or 9 guys out there parking these cars and bringing them into the people. And they'd show up, and we'd give them a parking tag, and they'd walk in the restaurant, and we'd park their car somewhere. And we had this, we had a huge parking lot. And his stepbrother showed up, David's stepbrother, and we had an extra room in this apartment. Well, this kid looked like Gyra Gearloose. He was wearing an ascot and a tweed jacket, and of course it's the '60s. We're already listening to Ian and Sylvia and the Beatles and Peter, Paul, and Mary and all this. This kid shows up, but he can play the hell out of a guitar. And he taught me how to finger pick, and that jump-started me into music. And then always wondering why on Ian's albums back then he had buckskin chaps on one time. They were chocolate brown with buck stitch down the sides. No hat. There would always be something. There was an Appaloosa horse in one of them. Just on the cover, there's always something kind of Western in some of those early Ian and Sylvia things. And that's when I learned Shortgrass. The first time I ever learned. That was my first Ian and Sylvia song. It was Shortgrass and The French Girl. 3 silver rings on slim hands waiting. And of course, all the other hits, that he had out in those days. And listened to Dylan and Peter, Paul, and Mary and Joan Baez and I Want to Hold Your Hand, Because that would have been 64, 63, 60. You go right out of high school. It seems like you graduate in 63, and that fall you're in high school, or you're in college in 63 for the first little semester or something like that. And hanging out in a roommate, and you're listening to all this stuff that people are playing. But the main thing was Dave Heck's brother, who could just play the hell out of a guitar. And he taught me to play with 3 fingers and a thumb, rather than Travis style, where you're using this finger and your thumb back and forth. You were, with the thumb going back and forth, you were using this finger and your thumb for that. And so you taught this finger how to work. Otherwise, you only teach these two fingers how to work in your thumb. And so later, I switched back to Travis much later, but I also found out that I had taught this finger how to pick. And so, and Junior plays with a flat pick in these two fingers. Like, and he sounds like, Scruggs. I can't do it that easily, but if I'm flat picking, this finger is useful. Whereas a lot of times if you never used it, it's not very useful. And so I can actually do things like that. Not a ton. I'm not, Jerry Donahue, but that was the real start of music, was when I ran into that kid as a roommate, and we lived together. You could play guitar with him every night, and that kicked me in the butt. And then I started going to pawn shops and fiddling around, looking at guitars, buying guitars, harmonies, and that's all I could afford was Stellas and harmonies. And then being a woodworker, I could hot rod them a little bit and tweak them. Taught myself what felt good. And, when I was in high school, I barely could get into college because my grade average was C+. So state colleges didn't want me. I don't know how they got me in Ohio State. They took me. And I got C+ grade average because I either got A's or D's. And no counselor ever tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Stevens, you must like to do that and you don't like to do that." Nobody mentioned that to me. I just did what I did. One of those things was high school woodshop. And when I was a senior in high school, I was the assistant teacher of high school woodshop as a senior. If Riffle couldn't make it, if Gene he lived out in the country, if he got snowed in, they'd call me from study hall and say, "Mike, Gene can't make it, you go down and teach woodshop." I just folded my books and go to the woodshop. And then every study hall I ever had, I'd take about 5 minutes do my lessons in study hall and hold up my hand and go to the woodshop. And I would help him with the younger kids, keep them from cutting their fingers off and hurting themselves, and teach them things. So when I started messing with guitars, it was like, I understood wood and tools and all that kind of stuff. And what really got me in the guitar business, I was always buying and selling the guitars and fiddling around a little bit and doing my stuff. And I bought a 1946 Martin Herringbone D28. And it had no truss rod, and it was dot inlaid, but still Brazilian rosewood, and it had been refinished. But like a dumbass back then, and everybody was doing it, I decided I'm going to put shallower gears on it, better tuners, right? So I have a little while, and I would go buy gold shallower gears and take it to my little shop, and I'm very carefully going to drill with a hand drill halfway through, so because you only have to drill halfway through for the body of the gear to go in there. And first one goes, I have some tape on it. I go, and it works fine. The second one, it just grabbed it and went, whoomp. And I panicked. And, so turned the guitar over, and nothing happened. They drilled the hole all the way through. You put the gear in there, put it in there, you couldn't tell. Turned them back over and drilled them all that way. Boom, 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 boom. Chipped every one of them. Chipped the veneer on the peg head. So I took it to Lundberg's Music, and whom I worked for later. He was the hip acoustic store in Berkeley, decades before Gruen.
So you wound up in Berkeley, California.
Yeah, this is where I was. And I went out there chasing Alice, because her grandmother lived in Walnut Creek up the road. And I'd read about Berkeley in high school, looking around for colleges, and I just read about the whole scene. It stuck in my head. It's intriguing. So I'm out there, and they wanted $35 to put a new veneer on the peg head and a decal and put finish on it. I thought that was ridiculously high price, and I took it home and went to my friend Campbell Coe, another old guru guitar guy, little alley shop, and I got some rosewood and cleaned it and did everything and glued that on there and did everything and put finish on it. And I played it without a Martin decal for years. till I finally got to, known by Martin, and Dick Boak sent me a decal. I put it on it, And somebody heard about that, and so they had me fix your guitar. Can you do this? I'm working construction. I'm working on BART, the subway tunnel system. And I'm making a fortune. So I'm making $70 to $100 a day in 1969, 70. At some point, I'm working on, Sarah Ohlendorf had brought me her guitar. Attractive young lady. I worked on it and gave it back to her, and then she still had a buzz, and she called me up, and I said, I'll fix it. And I'll call you in a couple of days. When I called her in a couple of days, and somebody else has already fixed it, and it turned out to be Larry Jameson, who was just opening a guitar repair shop. And so I want to go see who's fixing this guitar for Sarah, because I've got an eye for Sarah, Turned out to be Larry starting his little shop, so I started hanging out with him. He and I hit it off, just socially, just great. And little bitty guy, kind of, I think, Portuguese background, but big black mustache, great guitar player, great bass player. But he did everything by hand with chisels and things, which was fine. But once we started working together, of course, I had all that woodshop background. I started saying, well, make a jig here. I could do that with a router in about 2 seconds. Once I set the jig on it, zoom. And when the BART thing sort of petered out, when I was, working for BART, and we got all the subway tunnels to San Francisco and out into the valley, and and I made a fortune. I ended up buying a house and lots of guitars. Larry and I, he was just starting Guitar Resurrection, and we moved it up to Berkeley, and I became an official member of Guitar Resurrection. And, he knew all about guitars. I knew all about tools. And he taught me everything I needed to know about guitars, and we set up a shop, and we were the hip rock and roll shop in Berkeley. And Larry and I, we did lots of the rock and rollers. Country Joe McDonald of the Fish was one of my customers, and John Cipollino, Quicksilver, and I hadn't thought about this list but we had Tower Power, all the East Bay guys, and I had Bobby Weir of the Dead, but Garcia hung out with Prune Music and Sausalito, and Jesse Colin Young of the Youngbloods. What a sweet guy that was, and all the local bands, the rock bands, we had them all. They were coming in there. For them, we were doing mostly acoustics, but for Jesse, I did all acoustic stuff for him, and the rest of it was a lot of rock and roll.
Michael Stevens' career as a guitar builder eventually took him to Austin, Texas, where he opened his shop and did work for people like Stevie Ray Vaughan, Albert King, and Ray Benson. In 1986, he was asked to be one of the co-founders of the Fender Custom Shop in California. In 1991, he opened his shop in Alpine, Texas, where he lives and works today. Michael has built guitars for a wide range of players, but he's perhaps best known for the double-necked guit-steel that he made for country artist Junior Brown.
There was a lot of misinformation in the very beginning about the guit-steel, which has all gotten sorted out over time because interviewers get it wrong. So they'd ask Junior about that, but what happened was before that double neck and before Fender, and this would have been about 82, you remember a guy named Christopher Cross? A song called Sailin'? And you might have to look that up. But I built a double neck for Christopher Cross. Eric Johnson brought him out to my shop, and he wanted a Stratocaster Fender 12-string joined at the hip. So we, I used Fender necks and most of the parts from a Fender 12-string, and I built this guitar for Christopher Cross, and it looked like Fender did it. I mean, I didn't do anything weird. No bizarre, nothing. Everything, what I was trying to do, and I later did on Juniors, was I just tried to do what I thought Fender would have done. Their design style, and put the two together and attach them to where it's ergonomically easy to play. Even though double necks are generally hard, they're generally a little harder to play, but they usually weigh more. And Christopher Cross, it's the only time anybody ever got 5 Grammys. He got them all. And it was kind of soft rock, bubblegum, I don't know. Chris has always been a friend of mine, and he did the theme music for Arthur later in years, and that guitar and all that write-up made Billboard magazine, which we thought, wow, here we are. There's my picture of me holding this guitar in Billboard magazine. I made it, right? Well, I was waiting for the checks to roll in, but anyway, Junior saw it at some point. He'd been playing steel guitar and regular guitar, and his steel guitar was standing up on tall legs because he didn't use pedals. It was regular, like Leo McAuliffe with his Bob Wills. Those were non-pedal guitars. And you could sit down and play it in your lap, or if you had 3 or 4 of them, you had to stand up. But he had his guitar hanging on his case or on his chest on a strap, and every time you'd step up to the steel guitar, your guitar would bang into it. And he got tired of that. And at the time was playing a Gibson 330 and his Fender steel guitar. But he was wanting somebody to make him a double neck, make a guitar. And so then he saw Christopher Cross's guitar and said, okay, that's the guy I want. And I was on 12th Street by then. I'd moved into town, and it'd been 85. And he shows up and with this concept. And of course, I wouldn't have thought of it. I mean, never occurred to me. We talk about it, and the only thing, and he had a Bullet guitar, which was a real cheap import, or maybe not, but it's a cheap Fender guitar. It has a sort of a Telecaster neck, and he likes skinny necks anyway, so it suited him. He liked the way the pickups sound. The bodies were made out of MDF fiberboard, and painted. They were horrible. But he liked the neck. So we had that, and he had a regular String Master steel, 8-string steel, and he just wanted me to glue them together. I went, no, I'm not going to do that. It'd be horrible. By the time I screw around and do all that, we just build something that'll be better than that, and it won't fall apart. So he said, okay, the only thing I don't want a horn. Like a Stratocaster has a horn up top. A lot of guitars go up in front of you. The Telecaster has a little bump, but he said, I want a horn up there. It's got to be kind of telly. So that's what I want. So I said, okay. So I got to the drawing board and started messing around with it, and pretty much came up with what you've seen, except we messed around with where to match those two bodies up. And what I did was built this sort of a body similar to what you see on the guitar, and made a lap steel body, and we hooked them together with great big rubber bands from Office Supply, the big wide ones, and that way we could kind of tweak them. You could move the neck out this way, move the neck out this way, and figure out where it should be, to where the neck, and then because he was reaching over the guitar to play the steel, and in those days he was standing up with that guitar. And when he went on tour with Sleep at the Wheel, he was still standing up with that guitar. And so he would, and that little notch in the back where the body goes back there, when he would play steel, he would pull it up and tip everything downward, and that his elbow was in that little notch, kind of, so he could play steel. What happened was that when you play steel, you bend the bar this way, you bend the bar that way. Change the chord, you're getting notes across those strings. Well, you just when it was down here, you just couldn't get this one. You couldn't get your hand back up to get this chord here, which is real easy if you're playing a steel like in a lap. You go that way. When you got it down here, your arm is just not wanting to do it. And so that's when he invented this. He invented the stand and came up with that idea because he decided he could play guitar he'd compromise a little, lean over. And so that's what I did. Painted it, and off he went with it, I've got still some Polaroids from the very first day. But
how many of those have you made for him?
3.
3.
4. Well, counting the pedal steel stand-up one, I made 4. I don't know if you've been to the Junior Brown fan page. He talks about the pedal steel one. But eventually, the word, in all the interviews in the magazines that came out, that it was his concept and my design. Because I wanted to make it look like Fender did it. Once again, and that's why the guitar has a stepped lip on it, and the steel has a stepped lip. And the original steel stepped lip is only like this. On mine, it's like that, because he's reaching over a guitar neck, right? So I just made the steel step up a little higher just to keep his arms off the strings, and so it's this way, and it's this way. And then the peg head, I did a step up on it just to mimic the body. And then we had cases made, and it's what he's been playing. And we don't know where the red one is. It's gone. It got, they never have, other than when I was getting ready to ship this blue one, and he called me, he had the blue one at Cowboy Poetry here. And I'd already shipped the guitar to him when I got back from Elko. But I had to ship it to his manager in Nashville. And the yellow one, the one I made first, which was really white when it started out, it was blonde, just blonde, white, see-through. Over the years of nasty smoke in bars, was getting kind of yellow. He had given it to Bobby Cudd, his manager, and so when the red one got stolen, he borrowed it back because, how are you going to make any money if you don't have a guit-steel? That's what you do. So Tanya was in Branson with the guit-steel, and Junior was in Santa Fe working on his house, and where they're doing the podcast is up. They've got a studio up there now. And so she was going to drive to Memphis with the guit-steel. He's going to fly to Memphis. They're going to do a gig on Friday night, and then they drive to Nashville. That's 250 miles or something. Pick up the blue one, which I've shipped to Bobby Cudd's. And so I'm just getting out of my truck at the Holland, and the phone rings, and it's Junior. And he's got it. He said, man, it's like a 57 Chevy, because there's a blue metallic color. I'd sent him all my samples. I said, pick a color. This is what I got. I don't have to order it. We don't have to wait. Pick, he said, the bluest one. I went, okay, fine. And he played it for him, talked about a couple of things, and then said, okay. He said, man, I like it. Okay, he said, I got to go. We got to be on stage in 30 minutes. He's had the guitar for an hour. He walks on stage at the Grand Ole Opry and plays that sucker. And he's been playing it ever since. I did try to be a preppy for a little while in college. Short hair and khaki pants and sweaters and all that. I don't know why I was trying to shake that image, but it didn't last very long, I'll tell you that. It just wasn't right. So you saw the saddle, that old Letty saddle that's sitting out there. And it's a pretty little seat. It's only about 13 inches. My dad was 5'7" and weighed 142, 145 in his prime. I'm 6'2" and weigh 180, so that's why that saddle's so small. But it's what he ordered, And it's that tree is a pretty good round swell tree, pretty voluptuous horns on it, and it's called a low bull moose. Not a tree you see around much anymore, and a lot of times I don't quite see a moose that looks like that. Whereas when I was a kid, they all seemed to look like that to me, Regular bull moose was a little higher, and that one's kind of low and round, and I think just a classic saddle. I think Tommy Vaughn rides a moose. I think he had one built. I know that Capriolas used to build a moose. They called it a moose, and there was variations. But that's what the name of the poem was Low Bull Moose. I remember the day that big box arrived for it gave birth to a dream now over 70 years it survived. And a passion was born like a part to an actor, nourished then by stick horse and a bright orange tractor. Now the first thing Dad did was he set up a stand, a throne he'd made for this rig sure to be grand. Then he pulled out that saddle and he set it on the rack. Our chatter subsided. We were all taken back. Well, it was full flower carved, built for work or for show, and the maker's cartouche was Letty, San Angelo. Well, Steve was hand-tooled on the small Cheyenne roll, a full double rig. It came loaded with soul. But the detail of the fenders caught my bright-eyed young stare, a bronc and a buster his hat in the air. Now a man with two sons, it saw many a mile of unfaltering service and then sort of fell out of style. So up to the top rack to rest in the dust, why, calf roping kid, I felt a bowman a must. And then, like many young men raised in this style, the wanderlust struck, and I thought I'd rodeo for a while. So I headed out west, adventure bound. I made quite a few circles getting my feet on the ground. When I got to the coast, it was swim or turn around, so I went back to Texas, best place for me I'd found. And when the old man died, I flew home from a show, and when the affairs were all settled and it was time for me to go, my mother's question was answered, though she had to know. I packed his carbine, and that saddle from San Angelo. And I've ridden a lot of saddles down through the years, some dictated by function, others fashion and peers. But when life's little hassles just won't turn me loose, I go for a ride on that old low bull moose. With that leather creaking and my spurs a keeping time, I get away from it all without spending a dime. And my old man is a tough one. Hardly a saint, of course, but I do remember him fondly when I set that saddle on a horse. Low bull moose. I think after I'd been around cowboy poetry for a little while and working the O2 is when I came up and I wrote two poems right back to back almost. That one, and then I wrote one about O2, a Maverick. It was a play on ode, to a Maverick. Because that's what we were gathering down there, And one day, Tommy Vaughn and we were all on this side of Santiago's, that flat mountain you saw over there. And we were clear back over there, and we had a trailer load of bulls and cows, I don't know what. And so two of the guys in Dacus took that load back to headquarters, and hell, that was 25 miles from where we were at. And so Tommy and I we had pony all these horses. We each had a couple of horses, a pony, I think. So I pulled out my 30-30 and I tied it on the saddle, thinking, what the hell, it feels good to, I'm not expecting to fight my way out, but I just thought I'll throw the 30-30 on. Because all of us had pistols. I had a 41 mag Ruger, and everybody's carrying a gun because those bulls were nasty. And we start trotting back. And the truck disappears. And we talk sometimes, and then sometimes we don't talk, and sometimes we just trot. And if you didn't see a jet stream or a little piece of barbed wire, most of the wire back there was gone, it was like I was in a different century. And it suddenly dawned on me where my dad went. Sometimes when my brother and I were riding with him, we'd be out and he'd ride we had a quarter section, so we'd ride all different places. And he'd maybe stop on a little ridge somewhere and you just didn't talk to him. We knew there was times you didn't talk to him. If there was a look, he'd stop. And I thought, this is where my dad is. This is where he was. He would riding with his sons, but he'd stop on this little hill. He was back on a ranch somewhere in Midland. And we would just sit there and not say a word. And we don't know where he was. He was somewhere, and I thought, this is where he was. Just two cowboys riding along, ponying some horses, whatever, packing a rope, chaps. This is where my dad went back then. And I didn't understand as a kid those kinds of things, or what that meant,
All right, folks, that's it for today's episode. I'd like to thank Michael Stevens for taking the time to visit with me. You can find out more about Michael at stevensguitars.com. I'd like to thank Republic Boot Company for sponsoring this episode. You can find out more about Republic Boots at republicbootcompany.com. I'd like to thank my Patreon Trail Boss member, Bob Kelly, for his support of this show. You can find out more about me and this show at andyhedges.com. If you're enjoying the show, you can make a donation on the website, or you can become a patron at patreon.com/cowboycrossroads. You could also leave a rating and review on the iTunes store, or you could simply tell a friend to listen to the show. If you'd like to contact me with a question or a comment or a story, I'd love to hear from you. Send an email to andy@andyhedges.com. Thank you for listening to Cowboy Crossroads.